As we all know, we're locked in a struggle with an invisible enemy. I'll call it COVID-19, just so I don't run into any problems or distract you from the points I'm trying to make. And people like calling it a war. People on the left, people on the right. But to me, it's kind of interesting because I'm a military historian. I was trained as a military historian. I worked as a military historian. I taught military history, lecture about military history, write articles about military history, write books about military history. But I also work in a university where I'm, you know, outnumbered by people on the left who don't like war, don't like military history, don't like the idea of studying it. I guess they think that if we don't study it, maybe it'll go away. Just as, if we didn't study disease, maybe disease would go away. Or if we didn't study cancer, cancer would go away. Or if we didn't study poverty, poverty would go away. Of course, it's ridiculous. But these same people are eager to use the concept of war when they describe problems that we face. We've had, the war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on this, a war on that. And, I find that odd that people who don't like war use the idea of war to combat something like COVID-19. And it's not that I think that that's unfounded. I do think we're in a war with COVID-19, or whatever you want to call it. I would call it the CCP virus, but that's just me. But we are at a war. We are locked in a war. But what we're not doing is understanding the implications of using the phrase, the war on COVID-19. When you're in a war, your goal isn't to avoid, primarily at least, to avoid suffering casualties. Your goal is to win. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, Franklin Roosevelt and the United States suddenly found themselves in a war in the Pacific. 4 days later, the 11th of December, Adolf Hitler declared war in the United States, the Fuhrer, the Nazi Fuhrer, Nazi Germany. And we found ourselves in a global war. Now, what did Roosevelt do? Did he say, we're in a war, lots of people could get killed, so I want you all to stay in your basements, stay in your houses, and don't come out? We're just going to hunker down, and hopefully at some point the Japanese and the Germans will run out of energy or get tired of doing whatever they're doing, and we can minimize our casualties this way. No. Franklin Roosevelt's goal wasn't, it's not that he wanted casualties, but the primary goal he was fighting for was to preserve the United States, to preserve its government, to keep us from being run by the Nazis or run by the Japanese or run by some combination of the two. That was the goal that he was fighting the war for. Now, along the way, to achieve that victory, what he wanted to do was to minimize casualties, hopefully. But when we had to face the prospect of very high casualties, he was ready to run those risks. If we hadn't run those risks, we never would have landed in Normandy in 1944 and begun the liberation of Europe from the West. If we wouldn't have landed in Sicily or Italy or North Africa, my God, we certainly wouldn't have landed on Okinawa, where, for some stinky little island to invade Japan, as a springboard to invade Japan, we suffered horrible casualties. Roosevelt would have said, if it's going to cost us more than a few thousand men, we're not going to do it. And we would have lost the war. Lincoln, in the Civil War, what was his primary goal? Minimize casualties? No. Initially, it was to preserve the Union. Later on, it was to preserve the Union and eliminate the institution of slavery. And to do that, he was willing to accept casualties to get to that goal. The 1864 campaign, especially the overland part of it, where Grant was driving against Lee toward Richmond, Union suffered horrendous casualties. I mean, Cold Harbor was just a debacle for the Union Army. But, Lincoln supported Grant, who kept pushing. We kept suffering heavy casualties. But eventually we won the war. We preserved the Union. and we ended the institution of slavery. That doesn't mean all the racial problems disappeared, but at least the institution of slavery was gone, and that was something. And along the way, we suffered all those casualties. And that's my point with COVID-19. What should be our goal here? And this is the difference between, say, Dr. Fauci and President Trump. Dr. Fauci's view is legitimate. His view is, how do you deal with COVID-19? How do you minimize how many people die from it? But Trump has to have, any president would have to have a different view, because the goal isn't just to limit the number of casualties we suffer, the number of deaths. It's also to preserve the United States. Do we want to go into a Great Depression again for 10 years? Do we want to do that? I mean, how many lives would that cost in the long run? There's already people writing about, I just had a kidney transplant in November. 2 months later, these were considered, unnecessary. I mean, there are people out there who were in much dire straits than me waiting for a transplant who aren't getting them. And if their condition gets worse, then you get kicked off the transplant list because you have to be able to do certain things to get on it. How many people are going undiagnosed for cancer who, if they've been diagnosed earlier, might have lived? How many of those will die? How many people are losing their jobs? How many people are losing their businesses? I mean, there's a poor guy I know of on Dale Mabry Billboard up here in Tampa. He had just opened a new Italian restaurant, I don't know, maybe a week before everything shut down. I don't know if he's still going to be there. Hopefully he'll be able to ride this out. But, he took a year trying to get that thing set up. And, boom, his legs are cut out from under. What happens to these people? Will some of them commit suicide? Will some of them be ruined? Will their children not go to school because dad's bankrupt? I mean, what are the costs of the shutdown? And that's what the president has to weigh here, And does that mean if we open, some more people might die than if we don't? That may be true. But how long do you keep everything locked down? I've seen Zeke Emanuel on TV saying we shouldn't end the lockdown until we develop a vaccine. It's a virus. I mean, we don't have a vaccine for the common cold. And the common cold has been with us, forever. I can remember I was out in the workforce in the late 70s and the early 80s when what people called in those days the gay plague. Today it's AIDS or HIV, another virus. Do we have a vaccine for that? We still don't. It's been 40 years, or maybe over 40 years, depending how you want to count the dates. What if we don't get a virus? Hopefully we'll have a virus by the fall, or maybe next year. But what if we don't? How long do we stay shut down? We can't stay shut down forever. If you can't do something forever, if something won't last forever, it's not going to last. We can't keep printing money. You can print money for a while. I mean, there's all kinds of things. The Obama administration did quantitative easing, which is basically printing money. But that's because they had the deflationary forces at work that would offset the inflationary forces that would come with quantitative easing. And to some extent, we still have that today. But you can't keep just printing trillions of dollars, several trillions of dollars a year. I mean, if you look what we've already spent and what the Democrats are proposing to spend, you're looking at what, $5, $6, $7 trillion in basically printed money or borrowed money, most of which comes from, bought by the Chinese, at least in the past. You can't keep doing that. The economy will collapse. People will go hungry. There won't be. If the states don't have money, they can't pay benefits. People won't get paid. And the states are going to suffer next year, even if we just end it now. I mean, there are people who aren't paying state income tax because they're not working. They're not paying federal income tax. But the feds can print money, the states can't. And what's going to happen when the state budgets have to get cut? What's going to happen when, the state university systems get cut? What's going to happen when, the state police get cut, or whoever, the State Bureau of Investigation gets cut? All these different agencies get cut. People get laid off. Services drop. What if they can't What happens if they're not going to fund people who are working, but they're going to continue to fund people who don't? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. If you had a job and you lost it, you're screwed. But if you were living on welfare, you're still going to get cash. I mean, you're going to have a revolution in this country. I've been saying for 3 years that a civil war is coming. What I didn't know was what the spark would be. If we don't play this right, this could be the spark that sets off, a civil war in this country. The two sides today are more set apart from one another than they were on the eve of the American Civil War. The eve of the American Civil War, they were, there was a minor thing with tariffs and a larger thing involving slavery. But for the most part, the people thought the same. They believed in the same things. They had the same religion. They had the same concepts of Republican government, of democratic institutions, churches. They read the same literature. They read the same philosophers. They read the same Bible. Today, we don't have any of that. We have differences, maybe none are as sharp as the difference over slavery, but you have abortion. The people on the right and the left have different views on religion. They read different literature. They read different philosophers. I mean, right down the line, there's more setting us apart today than there was on the eve of the American Civil War. And that's a dangerous situation that we find ourselves in. And, what's necessary, just as in 1860, there was a spark that set it all off, the election of Lincoln. Something could set it off today. Now, I didn't know what that would be. I actually recorded a video on this months ago. I didn't know what the spark would be, but maybe this will be the spark if it's not played right. And that's my fear, is that it's not going to be played right. And you can already see that in what's happening now with this idea of shutdown, idea of limiting people's rights because of the virus. We're coming unfrayed. We're coming divided. Before, you had left-wing states, the blue states as they're called, not going along with the federal government, with illegal immigrants, protecting them, not cooperating with the federal government. Now you've got the red states not wanting to cooperate with lockdowns and things like that. So you got the two parts now are even getting more further divided. And the other thing that's happening is, whether you like it or not, is people are losing faith, not just in the institutions of government, but in science and in experts. I mean, the experts have so often been so wrong from the beginning of this. You don't need to wear a face mask. You do need to wear a face mask. Maybe you really don't need to wear a face mask. You should wear a face mask. I mean, they can't give you a straight answer on anything. There's nothing to fear. We're not going to have a problem. People aren't trusting the World Health Organization anymore. And to a great extent, a lot of people who don't trust the wisdom of Dr. Fauci, who, after all, is an 80-year-old guy who's been on the job for decades, probably too long. I mean, I don't remember life without Dr. Fauci. Why hasn't he retired? I'm 68. I'm retiring tomorrow. It's my last day. This guy is almost 80 years old, and he's still on the job, working very hard. I mean, I know he doesn't look 80 years old, and he's very fit. He seems to have his senses about him, unlike some other people I can think about. But still, he's been. Has anybody been in a job that long? I was a chair of a department once for 8 years, and toward the end, even though I'd been elected to another then 4-year term, or 5 years now, I really felt maybe I was in the job too long. Maybe it was time to get somebody new in there. So I agreed with the dean to go somewhere else, and somebody else took over the department. And I think that was a healthy thing. And that was only 8 years. This guy's been doing this for like 40 years. And fewer people. I'm sure if you did a poll back in early January and said, do you trust Dr. Fauci? People would have said overwhelmingly yes. I don't think you'd get the same result today. And I certainly don't think you'd get the same result with the World Health Organization or with, for many people, their own governors. I mean, I live in Florida, and we haven't had the problems with state overreach that you see in some of the other states, where people do some really strange stuff. We seem to have avoided that. But then again, outside of Miami, we haven't really been hit hard. I mean, yesterday I think the death toll in Florida, and it's hard to say exactly because I can go to different places and find different numbers. But if I go to the same place every day, the place I usually go, yesterday it was 5 dead. Now, maybe other deaths will show up because they just weren't reporting on time. Who knows? So it might be a little higher than that. But we peaked out at about 3 weeks ago. It was like 56. So it's come way down. But there's still people, oh, we can't reopen yet. We can't reopen yet. Everybody's going to drop. Everybody's going to die. We can't reopen the schools. Everybody's going to die. There's going to be a second wave coming. There was a second wave with the influenza outbreak, which there was. Soldiers, over 1 million soldiers came back from Europe, and probably they brought a lot of it back with them. And they got into the ports, and then they got on the trains, and they spread it all over the country a second time. Is that going to happen this time? I mean, if I was calling policies, I would limit or maybe rule out, as we are right now, international flights, because I think they were what spread it. How else did it get here? People aren't coming by boat. And if you look at where were the worst outbreaks, it's places where you have international airports. In Florida, it was primarily Miami, to a lesser extent Tampa, Orlando, and Jacksonville. Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York City with its airports, and then you got northern New Jersey with its big airport, Newark. And to me, that's what it is. It's air travel. So we're all worried about some woman opening a hair salon in Dallas, that this is going to set off this outbreak of disease. What we really need to be worried about are international flights coming in. And I'm sure there's people coming in right now, even with all the limitations. Some are still coming in. There's still international flights flying in and out of this country. And I think that's the biggest thing we need to do, is to limit that as we move forward. And then you can start worrying about other things. So I think if you're going to say it's a war, then what you have to do is recognize that there are going to be casualties. You can't win this war without casualties. It just can't be done. And you may, you could cut down the casualty rates by not invading France on D-Day in 6th of June 1944. That would have limited casualties. I mean, they thought they might lose 50% casualties among the airborne troops. I mean, if Eisenhower had asked Roosevelt said, that's too high. Let's not invade Europe. We can't afford those casualties. No, but his priority, Roosevelt's priority, was to win the war, was to defeat the Axis powers. And he was willing to accept the casualties if they advanced that goal. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of Americans died, just as in the Civil War. 700,000 Americans died. And that was when the population was a tenth of what it is today. I mean, we had an American Civil War today, and we had the same casualty rates. I think they would be higher. You would have 7 million dead. If Lincoln took the approach of some of the people in this country now, he'd say, well, that's too high. We're just going to have to let the country fall apart. We're just going to have to let slavery continue for years, decades. Who knows how long it would have lasted. I would like to hope that at some point even the South would have said, we can't keep doing this. But if you could see what they were doing in the South into the 1960s, for a century, it's not inconceivable to me that slavery would have lasted well into the 20th century. How many people would have died from that? How many slaves would have died? How many would have been mistreated? How many never would have been born because of the conditions they were living under, or died early from childhood disease because they had no medicine or limited medicine? How do you put a figure on that versus the number of people who died trying to get rid of the institution? But that's what you have to do. If you want to win the war and you want to preserve your way of life, you have to accept casualties. And sometimes when I look at some of the people on the left today, I think they're willing to keep a place shut down, the whole country, because their goal isn't to preserve the United States. It's not to preserve our institutions. It's not to preserve our way of life. They just as soon see them destroyed, and hopefully they'll get the political power to reconstruct it the way they would like. in a more progressive, probably socialist society. And I do really think that. Otherwise, I don't understand some of the things that they want to do. They talk about a war against this pandemic, but they don't want to accept the fact that in a war, you lose people, you suffer casualties. And that's, we need to wake up. I mean, you want to minimize the casualties as much as possible. And we did that in World War II. I mean, one of the reasons we dropped atomic weapons on Japan was to minimize our casualties, not their casualties, our casualties, Chinese casualties, because there was a lot going on in China people don't even think about. Chinese people were suffering. We ended that by dropping the atomic bombs on Japan. That's the goal. You limit your own casualties, but you make sure your primary goal is still winning the war. And that's what we have to do. We have to win the war, and we're going to have to accept that we may have slightly higher death rates or maybe moderately higher death rates if we reopen faster than we might have. But if we don't reopen, we are going to destroy this country. We're going to destroy the fabric of our society. We may get through this losing fewer people and end up in a civil war where millions die. And we really do have to take these things seriously, because it's something that can't go on forever. Won't. And that's the lockdown. Can the lockdown continue forever? In theory, could we just lock down for 100 years? No, we'd all starve to death. The country would grind to a halt. It would fall apart. So then the question is, okay, if you can't do it for 100 years, how long can you do it? 50, 25, 10, 5, 3, 2, 1, 6 months? If you can't continue to do it, if it can't go on forever, it won't. At some point, we're going to have to accept that fact and accept that some people may die. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, I'm 68 years old. I just had a kidney transplant in November. I'm on drugs that suppress my immune system. I mean, I'm like the poster child for the likely COVID-19 victim. If it hits me, it's going to hit me hard. It may very well kill me. I hope if I was exposed to it that I wouldn't die. But, is my life more important than, would it be better if I live, but my children and grandchildren are wiped out, are financially ruined, lose their jobs, lose their homes because of the shutdown, if it continues too long? I mean, so far they're okay. So far I'm okay. But, are those risks worthwhile? And I think that they are. And from a personal level, I'm willing to take that risk to get this open. Right now, the state of Florida open. I mean, I'm making plans. I'm going out to dinner. I'm going out again tomorrow. We've got plans for the beach in July that we've just made. And, I'm going to take a degree of risk. Now, if things get really bad right before that, we'll cancel our plans. I'm not going to go out and, risk death just to save a couple $100. But, maybe that's just me. But I don't think it is. And just as, I was watching something on you saw it on Ponte Hoc, where they had to climb that cliff on D-Day, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, I guess it was. And they suffered horrendous casualties. And they knew they were going to suffer horrendous casualties. But those men were willing to do it. And they did it. And they took the place. And eventually they found the guns and they knocked the guns out. And you can argue that it was an important part of a successful D-Day invasion. But they knew what they were in for. They were willing to risk their lives to achieve the goal. And the goal was set by the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt. And that's what we have to do today. Trump's going to ultimately have to set a goal. And the governors in the states are going to have to set a goal. And to preserve their state economy and structure, they're going to have to open up and risk higher casualties. And there's just no way around that. We can't stay locked down like Zeke Emanuel said he wants us to do until there's a vaccine. It's just not inconceivable. I even saw somebody from WHO this morning, I forget who it was, who said there may never be a cure, there may never be a vaccine. And the coronavirus may end up being like HIV. It's just one of these things that we just have to learn to live with and to deal with, on a regular basis. But if that's true, we can't stay locked down in the hope that something's going to happen. We got to start opening up. It is a war, and we have to understand that, draw the proper conclusions, and by all means, try to limit the casualties along the road to victory. But the road to victory is not limiting casualties. The road to victory is saving this country, saving its economy, saving its society. That should be our primary goal. And I think it is President Trump's primary goal.